Hello everyone, before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's get back to the story. Stay tuned for the next part of Mark's journey as he navigates this strange new world of wealth, secrets, and a marriage that's far more than just a contract. Mark had made his decision, and the very next day, he found himself walking through the doors of a grand courthouse, wearing a suit that didn't quite fit him, but would have to do. The air was thick with the weight of what he was about to do. Marrying a woman he barely knew, for money, for a future he never dreamed possible. He felt the sharp contrast between his world and hers with every step he took. Eleanor was already inside, waiting at the altar, her poise and elegance unmistakable. She stood tall, calm, and composed, as though this was just another business deal. Mark couldn't help but feel a wave of insecurity wash over him. This wasn't just a marriage. It was a lifeline. But was it worth the price? The ceremony was brief. No flowers, no grand celebration. Just the sound of a quiet official pronouncing them husband and wife. Mark barely heard the words as they registered. He was too busy thinking about what it meant. He was now legally bound to this woman, whose wealth and power could take him places he could never have dreamed. But at what cost? As they walked out of the courthouse, Eleanor turned to him with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Welcome to your new life, Mr. Davis," she said, her voice steady, but there was something in her tone that made it clear this was just the beginning of something far more complicated than either of them had expected. Mark followed her out into the street, where a black limousine was waiting. It was sleek, polished, a symbol of everything he had never had. Eleanor motioned for him to get in. "We'll head to my estate now," she said. "It's where we'll be living for the foreseeable future." Mark hesitated for a moment, still processing everything that had happened. The limo door closed behind him with a soft thud, and he found himself surrounded by luxury. Eleanor, ever composed, sat across from him, her gaze focused ahead as the car sped down the road. Mark couldn't help but feel out of place. His life had just taken a sharp turn, and it felt like he was in over his head. They arrived at the estate in the evening, the grand mansion looming in front of them, its lights glowing against the darkening sky. It was like something out of a dream, or perhaps a nightmare. Mark had seen places like this in movies, but never imagined he'd step inside one. Eleanor led him through the front doors, where the interior was just as stunning. High ceilings, marble floors, grand chandeliers. It was a far cry from his small apartment, or the cramped room where he had spent most of his childhood. "This will be your home now too," Eleanor said, her voice as smooth as the polished floors beneath them. She showed him to a large guest room at the far end of the mansion, decorated with expensive furniture and plush carpets. It was comfortable, even luxurious. But Mark couldn't shake the feeling of being a stranger in this world. The room felt cold, impersonal, despite its beauty. As he unpacked his few belongings, Mark tried to push the feelings of doubt and unease aside. This was the life he had chosen. Or rather, the life that had chosen him. He had to remind himself of the reason he was here: to escape the crushing weight of his debts, to rebuild his life. But in the quiet of the room, with the soft hum of the mansion surrounding him, he couldn't help but feel that this deal, this marriage, wasn't as simple as he had imagined. Later that evening, they shared dinner in the grand dining room. The table was set for two, and the silence between them was heavy. Eleanor was polite, but distant. Mark felt like a guest in his own home, unsure of his place in this new world. The food was exquisite, but it felt tasteless to him. Everything about the night seemed to highlight the distance between them. "How do you like the house?" Eleanor asked after a long pause, breaking the silence. Her voice was casual, almost as if she were talking to a business associate rather than a husband. "It's beautiful," Mark replied, his voice low. "It's just a lot to take in." Eleanor nodded, her expression unreadable. "I understand," This is all part of the deal, Mark. You'll adjust. And remember, we are bound by this contract. We keep things professional. No emotions, no interference in each other's personal lives. We can help each other succeed in different ways, but that's all this is about. Mark's heart sank. He had known the terms of the agreement, but hearing her say it so plainly made it feel even more real. This wasn't a fairy tale. There would be no romance, no love. Just an arrangement. But he had agreed to this. He had no other choice. As the night wore on, Eleanor stood up from the table. I have some work to do. You're welcome to explore the house or rest for the evening. But remember, we're not really married in the traditional sense. Mark watched her leave the room, feeling a strange sense of emptiness. She had been cold, businesslike, and he had felt like an outsider in his own life. The thought of being in this marriage for the long haul without any emotional connection left a bitter taste in his mouth. Mark lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, thoughts swirling in his head. He was in a mansion, surrounded by wealth and luxury, but he had never felt more alone. Would this really be worth it? Was the price of security worth the emptiness he was already beginning to feel? He could only hope that as time passed, things would change. But for now, all he had was the cold reality of what he had gotten himself into. Stay tuned for the next part of Mark's journey as he navigates this strange new life and the unexpected twists that will come his way. The next few days were a blur of new routines. Mark had never been so immersed in luxury, yet he still felt like a stranger in his own life. Eleanor was always polite, but there was a distance between them that felt impossible to cross. Every day, he woke up in the massive guest bedroom, the soft sunlight spilling in through the curtains, casting long shadows across the marble floors. He would spend hours wandering the mansion, familiarizing himself with the place, but it all felt so empty without someone to share it with. One morning, Eleanor called him down to her office. The massive, glass-walled space overlooked the sprawling estate. Mark had never seen anything like it. The walls were lined with shelves of books and awards. Behind her desk sat Eleanor, as composed as always, working on her laptop. She didn't look up as he entered. I need you to attend a meeting with me today, she said without looking up. It's important. You'll be the representative of our partnership. Mark felt a jolt of panic. I'm not exactly experienced in this kind of thing. Don't worry, Eleanor replied, still not looking at him. Just be present. You don't need to speak, but you need to be seen. People need to know we're a team. That's all. Mark nodded, unsure. He had never been involved in corporate meetings, especially not in a place like this. But Eleanor had made it clear this was part of the deal. It was a game, and he had to play along. Later that afternoon, they drove to the meeting, Mark again feeling the weight of the limo's luxurious interior. They arrived at a high-rise building, the kind of place Mark had only seen in movies. Eleanor led him inside, her heels clicking sharply on the polished floor as they moved through a sleek lobby. She introduced him to several executives, men and women in expensive suits, all of them nodding politely at him, treating him like a ghost in the room. The meeting itself was a blur. Eleanor spoke confidently, moving through discussions with ease, while Mark sat silently beside her, nodding whenever someone looked his way. The entire time, he couldn't help but wonder if anyone knew the truth. Did they suspect that this was all just a contract? That he wasn't really part of this world? When the meeting ended, Eleanor stood up and shook hands with the others, a smile on her face that Mark had yet to fully understand. It was a smile that seemed almost rehearsed, but also very real. Well done, she said to him as they walked out. You played the part perfectly. Mark didn't respond. He wasn't sure if he had played the part well, or if he had simply been a prop, a tool in her larger plan. As they left the building and stepped back into the limo, he found himself reflecting on what this all meant. He wasn't just playing a role, he was becoming a part of her world. Whether he liked it or not, this was his life now. The next day, Eleanor was in a different mood. She had a gala to attend, a charity event that would put them in the spotlight once again. Mark was expected to accompany her, dressed in the finest clothes, acting as the picture-perfect couple. Eleanor had picked out a tuxedo for him, insisting he wear it without question. She was meticulous about every detail, from his tie to his cufflinks, and even though Mark hated the idea of wearing a suit that wasn't his, he didn't argue. As they arrived at the gala, the atmosphere was unlike anything Mark had ever experienced. The event was filled with celebrities, politicians, and business magnates. The room glittered with gold and crystal, and Mark felt completely out of place. Everyone looked at them as they entered, the spotlight shifting to them. Eleanor was in her element, charming everyone she met with practiced ease. Mark stood by her side, silent, trying not to feel like a fraud. The evening went on in a blur of handshakes and conversations he couldn't follow. People congratulated Eleanor, praised her work, and seemed to overlook Mark entirely, as if he was nothing more than a shadow beside her. He hated it. He hated the way they all treated him as if he was a stranger, an accessory to her success. But what could he do? This was the life he had chosen, or the life that had been thrust upon him. As the night went on, something unexpected happened. Eleanor, who had been all business, suddenly turned to him. "I know this isn't easy for you," she said, her voice quieter now, just for him. "But you're doing well. You're playing the part. You're helping me build something here." Mark didn't know how to respond. She was being kind, but it felt so out of place in this world of glitz and glamour. Was he really helping her? Or was he just a pawn in her game? Before he could say anything, a voice interrupted them. It was one of the other guests, a businessman with a slick smile who extended his hand to Mark. "Mr. Davis, I've heard quite a bit about you," he said, his eyes scanning Mark up and down. "Eleanor speaks very highly of you." Mark forced a smile, shaking his hand. "I'm just here to support," he replied, not sure if he was lying or telling the truth. As the night wore on, Mark found himself in the same position, stuck in the background, watching Eleanor take the spotlight. It was clear she had built this life, this empire, without needing anyone. And now, as her husband, Mark was just another piece in her puzzle. He couldn't deny the growing sense of discomfort in his chest. Stay tuned for the next part of Mark's journey as he begins to question the true cost of his new life and what it means to be part of Eleanor's world. Mark had begun to settle into his new life, or at least, he thought he had. Days blended into each other like a never-ending cycle of polished floors, crisp suits, and silent dinners. Eleanor had made it clear that their marriage was a business arrangement, and Mark had convinced himself that he could keep his emotions in check. But the more time he spent in her world, the more he found himself questioning everything. One afternoon, as Mark sat in the library, leafing through a book he had little interest in, he heard the sound of Eleanor's heels clicking against the floor. She walked in with a folder in her hand, her face as unreadable as ever. Mark closed the book and looked up at her. "I have a meeting tonight," Eleanor said, her voice as calm and controlled as always. "I need you to come with me." "Another one?" Mark asked, raising an eyebrow. "How many of these do we have to attend?" Eleanor paused for a moment, her gaze softening just slightly. "As many as it takes. People need to see us together. It's part of the deal." Mark nodded, his mind racing. He had grown tired of being the quiet, invisible husband at these events. He had no real purpose there, just a figurehead beside her. The endless handshakes and hollow conversations left him feeling empty. But tonight, something was different. Eleanor's words lingered in his mind. As many as it takes. What was she really asking of him? That evening, they attended another high-profile gala. The venue was grand, a glittering ballroom filled with the city's elite. Mark stood beside Eleanor, once again dressed in a perfectly tailored suit, but this time, something in him had shifted. He didn't want to be just a shadow beside her anymore. The tension between them had been building for days. He couldn't keep pretending that this arrangement didn't affect him. As the night went on, Eleanor was once again swept into conversation after conversation. Mark found himself standing alone, staring out at the crowd. He watched the guests mingle, laughing and talking like they had everything figured out. Meanwhile, he felt like a ghost, drifting through the event with no purpose. At some point, Mark found himself in a quiet corner of the ballroom, away from the noise and distractions. He took a deep breath, trying to collect his thoughts. He had always been the kind of person who liked to fix things, to make sense of chaos. But his life right now felt like an unsolvable puzzle. Just as he was about to turn around and return to the crowd, Eleanor appeared. She was standing in front of him, her face more serious than he had ever seen it. There was something in her eyes that he hadn't noticed before, a vulnerability, perhaps, or was it just weariness? "Mark," she said quietly, her voice different now. "I know this isn't easy for you. This whole arrangement." Mark felt his chest tighten. He had been waiting for this moment, the moment where they would finally address the elephant in the room. "Eleanor," he began, his voice uncertain, "what is this?" "Really?" "Because I don't understand anymore. I don't get what I'm supposed to be doing here." Eleanor sighed, stepping closer. "You're here to help me. To be my partner in this business. That's all this is, Mark. A partnership. I don't expect anything more from you. I never did." Mark stared at her, the frustration building inside him. "I thought we were supposed to be building something together. But I'm just a prop in your world. You don't need me here. You never did. So why keep pretending?" The words hung in the air between them, thick with tension. Eleanor didn't immediately respond. Instead, she glanced around the room, as though searching for something she couldn't find. Finally, she looked back at Mark, her expression softening just a fraction. "You think I don't need you?" Eleanor's voice was low now, almost contemplative. "Mark, I built this empire by myself. I don't need anyone to survive. But what I really want, is something real. This partnership, it's not just about business. It's about having someone who sees me for who I am. Not just as the woman in charge, but as someone who's lonely." Mark's heart skipped a beat. He had never expected her to say that. She had always seemed so confident, so sure of herself. He had thought she was the one in control, always the strong one. But now, as she spoke, he saw a side of her he hadn't realized existed, vulnerable, afraid even. Before he could say anything, Eleanor turned away, her face once again hiding behind the mask she had worn for so long. "I'm sorry," she said quickly, her voice hardening once more. "This is a business. Let's not forget that." Mark watched her walk back into the crowd, his mind racing with conflicting emotions. What had just happened? He was no longer sure of anything, least of all his place in this arrangement. He had come into this marriage thinking it would be simple, a contract with clear boundaries. But now, it seemed like it was anything but. As the night went on, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted between them. Eleanor had revealed a part of herself he wasn't sure how to handle. And for the first time since this all began, Mark wasn't sure if he wanted to keep pretending. Maybe it was time to stop playing the part and figure out what he truly wanted. Stay tuned for the next part of Mark's journey as he begins to question his place in this arrangement and the unexpected feelings that are starting to surface. The days following that gala were filled with a strange tension that neither Mark nor Eleanor spoke about. Mark found himself questioning everything more than ever, unsure of where he stood in this arrangement and, perhaps, unsure of what he wanted from it anymore. It wasn't just the wealth and luxury he had grown accustomed to, though that was undeniably tempting. It was the underlying emptiness of it all. The deal they had struck seemed so straightforward at first, but now, the more time he spent with Eleanor, the more he wondered if there was something more to their partnership or if he was just a pawn in her game. Mark woke up one morning to a quiet house, the vast silence of the mansion pressing in on him like a weight. Eleanor had gone out for meetings again, leaving him to his own devices. He walked down the long, marble hallway, the cold tiles beneath his feet echoing in the emptiness. His mind raced with everything that had happened over the past few days. Eleanor's words from the night of the gala kept replaying in his head, "I want something real. Could she have meant that? Did she really want more than just a business arrangement? Was he just imagining things, or was there something between them that was impossible to ignore? He shook his head, trying to push the thoughts aside. This was not supposed to be about emotions. It was a contract. He had agreed to this. But why, then, did he feel this strange pull toward her? Why did the thought of her being with anyone else unsettle him so much? Later that afternoon, Eleanor returned, and she looked different, somehow more tired, more withdrawn. She didn't greet Mark with her usual confident smile. Instead, she walked straight past him into her office without a word. Mark, unsure of what to do, hesitated before following her. He knocked softly on the door before entering. "Eleanor?" he asked gently. "Are you all right?" Eleanor glanced up at him from her desk, her expression unreadable. "I'm fine," she said quickly, though her voice lacked its usual firmness. "Just a lot of work to catch up on." Mark stood there, watching her. It wasn't like Eleanor to shut him out, especially not after their conversation at the gala. But now, she seemed so distant, almost like a stranger. The woman who had seemed so confident, so in control, was now breaking down behind closed doors. Mark felt a pang of guilt for not being able to help her, for not being able to understand the pressure she was under. "Eleanor, you don't have to do this alone," Mark said quietly, stepping closer to her desk. "I may not understand everything about your world, but I'm here for you." For a moment, Eleanor didn't respond. She looked at him, her eyes betraying a hint of vulnerability that she quickly masked with her usual composure. "It's not about that, Mark," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "This whole thing, this marriage, it's complicated. I didn't expect it to be this way. I didn't expect to rely on anyone." Mark felt his heart rate pick up. Was she finally admitting that she needed him? Or was this just another moment of weakness, a crack in her armor that she would quickly fix? He took a deep breath, his voice steady. "You don't have to do everything on your own. That's why we're in this together, right? We've got a partnership." Eleanor's eyes softened just a little. She nodded, but there was still something distant about her expression. "It's not that simple," she said, standing up and walking toward the window. "I don't know how to be anything other than what I've always been. Strong. Independent. I built this empire by myself. I don't know how to ask for help, and I don't know how to need anyone." Mark watched her, unsure of what to say. He had always thought of her as untouchable, someone who had it all figured out. But now, he was beginning to see the cracks in her facade. She wasn't the invincible woman he had thought she was. She was just as human as anyone else. He walked over to her, standing silently for a moment before speaking again. "I'm not asking you to change, Eleanor. I just want you to know that you don't have to hide everything from me. You don't have to keep everything locked away." There was a long pause before Eleanor turned to face him. For the first time in what felt like forever, she looked him in the eye, really looked at him. Her walls had come down just enough for him to see the exhaustion in her eyes, the cracks in her strong exterior. "You're right," she said quietly. "But I don't know if I can do this. I don't know if I can let go of everything I've built, of the way I've always been." Mark stepped closer, his voice soft but firm. "I'm not asking you to let go of everything. I just want you to let me in. We're in this together, remember?" Eleanor didn't respond right away. She seemed to be lost in thought, weighing his words. Finally, she nodded slowly, as though making a decision. "Maybe," she said softly. "Maybe we can try being real with each other." Mark's heart skipped a beat. For the first time since their marriage began, he felt like they were actually on the same page. It wasn't just a business arrangement anymore. There was hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, they could find something real in the midst of all the contracts and power plays. Stay tuned for the next part of Mark and Eleanor's journey, as they navigate the complexities of their partnership and the growing feelings between them. The days after that conversation felt different. For the first time in a long while, Mark found himself waking up with a sense of purpose, something more than just the weight of debt or the emptiness of the mansion. Eleanor had started to let him in, and he could see glimpses of the woman behind the polished facade. There were still walls, of course, but they weren't as high as before. Mark had begun spending more time with her outside of the corporate meetings and events. They went for walks around the estate, sometimes in silence, sometimes talking about things that didn't involve business or their marriage. It felt normal. Or at least, it was the closest thing to normal Mark had experienced in a long time. But there were still moments when the reality of their situation hit him. This wasn't a traditional marriage, and it wasn't about love. It was about survival. But for how long could they pretend it was just that? One evening, they were sitting in the grand living room after dinner. Eleanor was looking over some documents, her brow furrowed in concentration. Mark, sitting across from her, noticed the exhaustion that was starting to show on her face. She had always seemed invincible, always in control. But now, he could see the cracks. She was wearing herself thin, balancing the weight of her empire and her own emotions. For a moment, he considered offering to help, but he wasn't sure how. "Eleanor," Mark finally said, breaking the silence. "You're pushing yourself too hard. You don't have to do everything alone." Eleanor didn't look up from the papers in front of her. "I don't have a choice, Mark. This is my responsibility. It always has been." Mark stood up and walked over to her, sitting beside her on the couch. "It's not just your responsibility anymore," he said, his voice soft. "We're in this together. You don't have to carry the weight of it all by yourself." She looked at him then, really looked at him. Her eyes softened, and for the first time in weeks, Mark saw a flicker of something close to vulnerability. But just as quickly, she masked it, straightening her posture and looking back down at the papers. "I know what you're trying to do," she said quietly. "But this isn't something I can share. I've spent my whole life building this, and I can't afford to let anyone in. Not fully." Mark felt a pang in his chest, but he didn't pull away. He knew this was part of who Eleanor was. She had built her world alone, and it wasn't easy to let someone else in. But maybe, just maybe, she was starting to see him as more than just her husband in name. They were partners, yes, but there was something else growing between them, something Mark wasn't ready to name yet. The following day, they attended another event, this time a charity auction Eleanor was hosting for one of her foundations. Mark, as always, stood by her side, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. There was a spark between them, a quiet tension that neither of them had addressed yet. Every glance, every brief touch of the hand, felt charged with a new energy. At one point during the evening, as Eleanor was speaking to a group of potential donors, Mark found himself alone at the back of the room. He leaned against the wall, watching Eleanor in her element. She was a force of nature, commanding the room with her presence, her words flowing effortlessly as she spoke about the importance of the foundation's work. He realized then that he didn't just want to be the silent partner standing in her shadow. He wanted to be part of her world, not just in a business sense but in every sense. He wanted to break through the walls she had built, to truly know the woman behind the empire. But could he do that? Or was he just another accessory in her life, a placeholder until she found someone else who fit her perfect world? His thoughts were interrupted when Eleanor walked over to him, her eyes scanning the room before landing on him. She gave him a small smile, one that was genuine, but there was still something guarded in her expression. "You okay?" she asked. "Yeah," Mark replied, though he wasn't sure if he was lying or not. "Just thinking." "About what?" she asked, her curiosity piqued. Mark hesitated for a moment. Could he say it? Could he put into words what he was feeling, or would it make everything too real? Finally, he spoke, his voice low. "About us. About what this is, and what it could be." Eleanor's smile faded slightly, and she looked at him, her gaze softer now. "Mark, we've been through this before. This is a business arrangement. Nothing more." Mark's heart sank, but he pushed the feeling aside. He knew she wasn't ready to admit it, not yet. But maybe one day, she would. I know, he said quietly. I just wanted you to know that I'm here. For whatever you need. No strings attached. No business. Just us. Eleanor didn't respond immediately. She simply nodded, her eyes searching his for a moment before she turned back toward the crowd. Thanks, Mark, she said softly. But Mark couldn't tell if she meant it or if she was just saying the words. The night went on, but Mark couldn't shake the feeling that things had shifted between them. He had put himself out there, and though Eleanor hadn't fully embraced it, he could see that she was starting to let down her guard, even if only a little. Maybe, just maybe, this partnership wasn't going to stay as a business deal forever. Stay tuned for the next part of Mark and Eleanor's journey, where the boundaries between business and love begin to blur, and the real challenges of their partnership come to light. The days following their conversation felt different. Mark had always known that their marriage wasn't real, but something about Eleanor's words, something about the way she looked at him that night, had shifted something inside him. He had hoped that maybe, just maybe, they were beginning to build something more than just a business arrangement. But the reality of their situation was never far from his mind. Eleanor was still guarded, still keeping her distance. And Mark, despite all the progress they had made, couldn't shake the feeling that he was still just an accessory in her carefully constructed world. One afternoon, Eleanor asked Mark to accompany her to a business dinner. It was the same routine, the same polished world that Mark had been thrust into. He dressed in his best suit, the one Eleanor had picked out for him, and joined her at yet another extravagant event. The guests were the same wealthy, powerful people who seemed to have it all. Mark stood by Eleanor's side, watching her navigate the room with ease, talking with people like she had known them all her life. He felt like a stranger in this world, a pawn in a game he didn't fully understand. As the evening wore on, Mark found himself alone at the bar, nursing a drink. He had become accustomed to these events, but the emptiness he felt never went away. He had tried to talk to Eleanor, to ask her more about her past, her life before the empire, but she had always deflected. Every time he got close to knowing her, she put up another wall. He watched as Eleanor moved through the crowd, her charm and poise never faltering. But there was something different about tonight. For the first time, Mark noticed the exhaustion in her eyes, the way she seemed to withdraw a little more with each passing minute. It was as if the weight of everything, the business, the marriage, the life she had built, was starting to take its toll. Mark set his glass down and walked over to her. She was talking to a group of investors, her smile perfectly practiced, but Mark could see the tension in her shoulders. He cleared his throat, and she glanced at him briefly, a look of mild surprise on her face. Eleanor, Mark said, his voice low, we need to talk. The group she was speaking to dispersed, leaving just the two of them. Eleanor's gaze softened, though she still kept her distance. What's on your mind? She asked, her voice calm but guarded. Mark hesitated for a moment. He had been holding on to his thoughts, his feelings, for so long, but now it felt like the right time to let them out. You've been distant lately. I get it, made a deal, and I've stuck to my part. But this isn't working for me anymore. I'm not just your husband on paper. I don't want to keep pretending that everything is fine when it's not. Eleanor's expression shifted slightly, though her composure remained. Mark, she said softly, you knew what this was from the start. We agreed on the terms. This is business. Mark shook his head. It's not just business. Not anymore. I can see it in you, Eleanor. You're not okay. You can pretend all you want, but I see the cracks. I've been standing by your side, trying to help, but it feels like I'm invisible. I'm just a contract, a piece in your puzzle. Eleanor's eyes darkened, and for a moment, Mark thought she might shut him out, but instead, she let out a long breath and placed her hand on his arm. I'm not used to letting people in, Mark. I've built this life, this empire, all on my own. I've always been the one in control. I don't know how to need someone. I don't know how to let go. Mark's heart ached at her words. He had always admired her strength, but now, he saw the vulnerability she had kept hidden for so long. You don't have to let go, he said quietly. You don't have to do everything alone. I'm here for you. For real. No strings, no conditions. Just us. Eleanor's gaze softened, but there was a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words seemed stuck. Finally, she simply nodded, a small, almost imperceptible movement. Thank you, she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. The moment hung in the air, thick with unsaid words. Mark could tell that Eleanor wasn't ready to fully admit what was between them, but at least she was beginning to see him as more than just a business partner. It wasn't much, but it was a start. As the night continued, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. Eleanor had let him in, just a little, and for the first time, it felt like they were starting to build something real. He didn't know where it would lead, but he was willing to stay and see it through. Stay tuned for the next part of Mark and Eleanor's journey, where the lines between business and love continue to blur, and the challenges they face together grow even more complicated. The next few weeks passed in a blur. Mark and Eleanor had reached a strange, delicate balance in their relationship. They were no longer just a business partnership, but neither were they a traditional couple. There were moments of intimacy, shared laughter, and quiet understanding, but there were still walls between them, walls that neither of them was ready to completely tear down. Eleanor was still the woman who built an empire alone, and Mark was still the man trying to navigate his place in a world that felt both luxurious and isolating. One evening, after a long day of meetings and charity events, Mark found himself alone in their living room. Eleanor had retreated to her office to catch up on work, as usual. Mark sat on the couch, absent-mindedly flipping through a magazine, but his mind wasn't on the pages in front of him. He was thinking about what had happened in the past few days, about their growing connection. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't just trying to survive. He was starting to care about Eleanor, about what this marriage could become. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized that he still didn't truly know her. They had come so far, yet there was so much left unsaid. Mark's thoughts were interrupted when Eleanor walked into the room. She was dressed in a casual sweater and jeans, her hair slightly tousled from a long day. She looked tired, but there was a softness about her that Mark hadn't seen in a while. She smiled faintly when she saw him sitting there. "Hey," she said, her voice tired but warm. "I thought I'd find you here." Mark looked up, offering her a smile. "Couldn't sleep," he replied. "Thought I'd wait up for you." Eleanor walked over and sat down beside him, her body language relaxed, but her mind clearly elsewhere. "I'm sorry for shutting you out so much," she said quietly, her eyes avoiding his. "I know I've been distant, but it's hard for me to let go of control." Mark felt a lump form in his throat at her words. For weeks, he had been trying to break through her walls, trying to get her to open up, but he never thought it would be this hard. He wasn't asking for everything, just wanted her to trust him, to see him as more than just a piece of her business. "You don't have to do everything alone, Eleanor," he said softly, his voice full of sincerity. "I've been trying to figure this out for both of us, but it's not just about me being here for you. It's about us being here for each other." For a moment, Eleanor didn't say anything. She simply stared at the floor, her expression unreadable. Mark wondered if he had said the wrong thing, if she would pull away from him again. But then, after what felt like an eternity, she finally spoke. "I don't know how to let anyone in," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I've spent my whole life building walls, protecting myself, making sure no one gets close enough to hurt me. And now, I don't know how to stop." Mark's heart broke for her. He knew that Eleanor wasn't just talking about their marriage. She had been hurt before, by people she trusted, and that had shaped the woman she had become. But Mark wasn't like those people. He wasn't here to take from her. He was here to stand by her side. He reached over and gently took her hand in his. "You don't have to stop," he said softly. "You don't have to let down all your walls at once. Just, let me in. Little by little. We can build something together, something that's real." Eleanor looked at him, her eyes filled with something that Mark couldn't quite read. For a moment, it seemed like she might pull away, but instead, she squeezed his hand tightly. "I'm scared," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I'm scared of what happens if I let go. Scared of what it means if I start trusting you, if I let myself need you." Mark smiled gently, his thumb brushing against her hand. "You don't have to be scared," he said. "I'm not going anywhere. We'll take it one step at a time, I promise." Eleanor took a deep breath, as if she were trying to convince herself. Then, slowly, she nodded. "Okay," she whispered. "One step at a time." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of their words hanging in the air. For the first time in a long time, Eleanor didn't look so guarded. And for Mark, that small moment of vulnerability felt like a victory. It was a small step, but it was a step forward. Stay tuned for the next part of Mark and Eleanor's journey, where their partnership continues to grow, and the lines between love and business blur even more. The days after their conversation felt different. Mark and Eleanor had begun to navigate a new dynamic in their relationship. It wasn't perfect, but there was something real between them now, something they both had been too afraid to acknowledge before. The walls that had once separated them were starting to crack, slowly but surely. They still had their work to do, but Mark could see that Eleanor was trying. She was letting him in, one step at a time. As the weeks passed, their partnership began to evolve into something neither of them had expected. They were no longer just husband and wife in name, but they were also allies, working together in both business and life. Eleanor had started to rely on Mark more, not just for emotional support but for his insight and perspective. He wasn't just a passive observer anymore, was an active part of her world. One evening, they found themselves in the living room again, after another long day of meetings and events. Eleanor was sitting at her desk, reviewing some contracts, while Mark relaxed on the couch, his thoughts drifting. He had always been the kind of person who liked to fix things, to solve problems, but now, for the first time, he didn't feel the need to fix everything. He was content just being here, being part of something. With Eleanor. She looked up from her paperwork, catching him staring at her. Her eyes softened. "You okay?" she asked, her voice gentle. Mark smiled, a genuine smile that reached his eyes. "Yeah," he said, his voice warm. "I'm just thinking about how far we've come." Eleanor tilted her head, studying him for a moment before she stood up and walked over to him. She sat down beside him on the couch, her movements slow, deliberate. For the first time, she didn't feel distant or like she was hiding behind her role. She was just Eleanor. And Mark saw her not as a CEO, not as a powerful businesswoman, but as the woman who had built her life from the ground up, and who was learning to trust again. "I didn't think I'd get here," she said softly, looking at her hands in her lap. "I didn't think I'd ever let anyone in, not after everything. But with you, it feels different. It feels like I can finally breathe." Mark reached over and took her hand in his grip firm but gentle. "You don't have to do this alone anymore," he said, his voice filled with sincerity. "We're in this together. No walls, no pretenses. Just us." Eleanor's eyes filled with something Mark hadn't seen before, hope, maybe, or just the realization that she had found someone who truly understood her. She smiled, a soft smile that spoke volumes, and leaned in to kiss him. It was simple, but it was everything. A promise. A commitment. A new beginning. As they pulled away, Mark looked into her eyes and said, "I meant what I said. Whatever happens, we'll face it together." Eleanor nodded, her smile growing a little wider. "Together," she echoed, her voice full of meaning. The night ended quietly, the two of them sitting side by side, their hands intertwined. They didn't have all the answers, and they didn't know what the future held. But for the first time, Mark felt like he had a place in this world, and not just in Eleanor's world, but in a life they were building together. One step at a time. Stay tuned for the next chapter of their journey, where love, business, and trust continue to intertwine, and Mark and Eleanor learn what it truly means to be partners in every sense of the word.